The date is January 5, 1943. Dawn breaks over the Solomon Islands, painting the Pacific waters in streaks of blood orange and gold. Aboard the USS Helena, Lieutenant Red Cochran stands at his battle station, hands gripping the fire controls of a 5-inch anti-aircraft gun. His crew is exhausted. For months, they've been firing thousands of shells at Japanese aircraft, watching most detonate uselessly in empty sky, too early, too late, always just missing. But today is different. 4 Japanese Aichi D-3A dive bombers, called VOWs by Allied forces, scream out of the morning sun. They've just attacked the task force, and one has scored a direct hit on the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. Now they're banking away, escaping into the distance at 200 miles per hour. Cochran knows the odds. With conventional ammunition, hitting a maneuvering aircraft at this range is nearly impossible. It would take a miracle. He doesn't know that his gun is loaded with something the Japanese have never seen, something so secret that even most American sailors don't know it exists, something that will change naval warfare forever. Fire! The first salvo thunders into the sky. 5 shells arc toward the departing bombers. The crew watches, expecting the familiar sight of distant explosions, flashes of light that harm nothing but air. But then something extraordinary happens. One of the Japanese bombers suddenly lurches, trailing smoke. Its wing shears off. The aircraft spirals into the ocean, leaving a column of white foam where it impacts. The gun crew stares in disbelief. They didn't hit it. The shell exploded several yards away. Yet somehow, impossibly, it worked. What Lieutenant Cochran doesn't realize is that he's just made history. He's fired the first shot in combat using a technology so revolutionary that Winston Churchill will call it a war-winning weapon. A technology the Japanese will never understand, even as it destroys them by the hundreds. Before we reveal what happened in that explosive moment, make sure you're subscribed to witness one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets finally come to light. To understand the weapon that saved the USS Helena that morning, we need to go back to 1940, a year when the world was already at war, and America was watching nervously from across the ocean. The problem was simple, but seemingly unsolvable. Modern aircraft had become too fast, too maneuverable for traditional anti-aircraft guns. When a gunner fired a shell, it took several seconds to reach the altitude where enemy planes flew. By that time, the aircraft had moved. The shell would explode at a predetermined time or altitude. But if the timing was off by even a fraction of a second, it would detonate harmlessly in empty sky. The statistics were damning. To shoot down a single enemy aircraft with conventional time-fused shells required approximately 2,000 rounds. Ships firing anti-aircraft barrages were essentially throwing up walls of steel, hoping the enemy would fly into them. It was wasteful, ineffective, and terrifying for the sailors who watched enemy bombers pressing their attacks while shells exploded uselessly around them. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers in the Solomon Islands campaign, later wrote, "Mechanical time fuses which we had been using only brought down a plane at night by accident. They were good for harassing enemy aircraft at night, but that was about all." The U.S. Navy knew that when war came, and it was coming, their ships would be sitting ducks. Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers were among the best in the world, and their pilots were superbly trained. Something had to change. In August 1940, the National Defense Research Committee made a decision that would alter the course of the war. They assigned the impossible task of creating a proximity fuse, a shell that could sense when it was near its target and detonate automatically, to a physicist named Dr. Merle Tuve. Tuve was given a team, a budget, and a deadline. His organization was called Section T, His laboratory was housed in the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C. His mission was to do something that many experts believed was impossible: put a working radio inside an artillery shell. The challenges facing Dr. Tuve in Section T were staggering. To appreciate the scale of the problem, imagine trying to build a functioning computer, then firing it out of a cannon at 2,800 feet per second. That's essentially what they had to do. A proximity fuse needed to contain a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, technology that in 1940 filled entire rooms. This had to be packed into a shell just over 20 inches long and less than 5 inches in diameter. The fuse would also contain 7 pounds of high explosives, leaving precious little room for electronics. But size was only the beginning of the nightmare. When a 5-inch shell is fired from a naval gun, it experiences an acceleration force of 20,000 Gs. That's 20,000 times the force of gravity. The human body would be instantly crushed into paste under such forces. Glass vacuum tubes, the only electronic components available in 1940, would shatter like eggshells. Then there was the rotation. As the shell traveled through the gun's rifling, it began spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. Any components inside had to survive this dizzying rotation while continuing to function. The fuse needed to remain completely inert during handling and loading. A premature detonation would kill the gun crew. It had to activate safely after firing, avoiding exploding too close to the ship. It needed to work in rain, humidity, salt spray, and extreme temperatures. And it had to self-destruct if it didn't find a target, preventing the technology from falling into enemy hands. Oh, and one more thing. It had to be mass-produced by the millions, cheaply enough that the Navy could afford to fire them in combat. Many scientists said it simply couldn't be done. The British had been working on similar technology and had largely given up on radio-based fuses, focusing instead on photoelectric systems that used light sensors. The American team knew the British were probably right to be pessimistic. But Dr. Tuve assembled a team of brilliant minds who didn't accept the word impossible. They began experimenting, failing, and trying again. The clock was ticking. Pearl Harbor was just over a year away. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A scientist named Lloyd Berkner developed a system that separated the transmitter and receiver circuits within the fuse. This elegant solution allowed the device to detect the Doppler effect, the change in frequency of radio waves bouncing off a moving target. Think of it like this. When an ambulance approaches you, its siren sounds higher in pitch. As it drives away, the pitch drops. That's the Doppler effect. The proximity fuse worked on the same principle, but with radio waves instead of sound. The fuse would continuously transmit radio waves. When these waves bounced off an aircraft and returned to the fuse's receiver, their frequency would shift based on the relative speed between the shell and the plane. When this frequency shift reached a critical threshold, indicating the target was within lethal range, the fuse would trigger the explosive. But making this work required solving dozens of subsidiary problems. The vacuum tubes had to be completely redesigned. Scientist James Van Allen, who would later become famous for discovering Earth's radiation belts, created miniaturized, ruggedized tubes that could survive the incredible forces. Each tube was cushioned in specially formulated wax and embedded in dense dielectric oil to absorb shock. The battery presented another headache. It couldn't be active during storage or it would drain before the shell was ever fired. The solution was ingenious: a special battery that only activated when the shell was fired. The centripetal force from the shell's rotation would cause an electrolyte to flow into carbon and zinc plates, bringing the battery to life. By summer 1942, Section T had grown beyond the capacity of the Carnegie Institution. The entire operation was transferred to Johns Hopkins University and renamed the Applied Physics Laboratory, with Tuve as its first director. The team had expanded to include over 100 researchers, and production contracts had been signed with more than 100 American companies, including General Electric, RCA, Raytheon, Sylvania, Westinghouse, and even the Crosley Corporation, better known for making radios and refrigerators. Each completed fuse contained 130 miniaturized electronic parts. The cost was astronomical, over $1 billion in 1940s dollars, roughly $15 billion in today's money. On August 12, 1942, the moment of truth arrived. The newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland was conducting its shakedown cruise in Chesapeake Bay. Navy observers gathered for what was supposed to be a 2-day test of the new proximity-fused ammunition. The targets were 3 remote-controlled drone aircraft. The test plan called for extensive firing to evaluate the fuse's performance under various conditions. Everyone expected it would take many salvos to down the small maneuvering targets if the fuses worked at all. The guns opened fire. The first drone was destroyed almost immediately, then the second, then the third. The observers stood in stunned silence. The test had been scheduled for 2 days. It was over in less than 1 afternoon. 3 targets destroyed with just 4 proximity-fused projectiles. The Navy had seen enough. Production was immediately accelerated. By late 1942, the first 5,000 combat-ready shells were being shipped to the Pacific Theater. The secrecy surrounding them was extraordinary. They were given the deliberately vague designation VT fuse, standing for variable time, to disguise their true function. Officers who received them were told they were an improved time fuse, nothing more. The shells were distributed to 3 ships considered most likely to face air attack: the aircraft carriers USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga, and the light cruiser USS Helena. The commanding officers were given strict instructions. The fuses were to be used only over deep water, where any duds would sink beyond enemy recovery. If even 1 fuse fell into Japanese or German hands, reverse engineering might give the enemy the same capability. Officers who received them were told they were an improved time fuse, nothing more. The shells were distributed to 3 ships considered most likely to face air attack: the aircraft carriers USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga, and the light cruiser USS Helena. The commanding officers were given strict instructions. The fuses were to be used only over deep water, where any duds would sink beyond enemy recovery. If even 1 fuse fell into Japanese or German hands, reverse engineering might give the enemy the same capability. Lieutenant Cochrane aboard the Helena wasn't told exactly how the new ammunition worked. He just knew that some of his shells were marked special fused projectiles, and that he should use them if Japanese aircraft attacked. On the morning of January 5, 1943, that's exactly what happened. And when his guns opened fire, neither he nor the Japanese pilots diving on his ship understood that naval warfare had just fundamentally changed. The era of the proximity fuse had begun, and the Pacific War would never be the same. News of the Helena's success traveled fast through classified naval channels. The gunnery report from that engagement didn't mince words. The value of the Mark 32 fused projectile cannot be too highly stressed. One bomber clearly destroyed by a near-miss burst, possibly a second aircraft downed as well. And most importantly, it had worked exactly as designed. The shell had detonated at the optimal distance from its target, shredding the aircraft with shrapnel without requiring a direct hit. The Bureau of Ordnance immediately ramped up production and distribution throughout the Pacific Fleet. Admiral William Halsey, commanding Allied forces in the South Pacific, had been deeply concerned about Japanese torpedo bombers making nighttime attacks. Traditional time-fused shells were nearly worthless in the dark. Gunners couldn't see the targets to estimate range and timing. But proximity fuses didn't care about darkness. They worked the same way whether it was noon or midnight. In February 1943, just weeks after the Helena's first kill, another Japanese night attack demonstrated the new weapon's devastating effectiveness. Historical records by Samuel Eliot Morison describe the scene. The night flickered with muzzle flashes, tracers, flares, float lights, and the flaming pyramids of splashing Bettys. 5 Japanese G-4M Betty bombers were shot down by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. A convoy was saved. And somewhere in the darkness, Japanese pilots were dying without understanding why American guns had suddenly become so impossibly accurate. Throughout 1943, the statistics told an incredible story. Although only about 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition used in the Pacific had proximity fuses, those shells accounted for approximately 50% of all Japanese aircraft shot down by naval gunfire. That made them roughly 300% more effective than conventional time-fused shells. By year's end, 9,128 proximity-fused rounds had been fired, destroying 61 Japanese aircraft. That worked out to approximately 155 rounds per kill, compared to 508 rounds per kill with time-fused ammunition. The Japanese had no idea what was happening. Their pilots reported that American anti-aircraft fire had become uncannily accurate. Some speculated about new radar-directed gun systems. Others thought the Americans had recruited crack marksmen from rural areas. They never suspected the truth, that each shell contained a tiny robot brain that could sense their presence. As the Pacific War ground through 1944, Japan's situation grew increasingly desperate. American forces were island hopping across the Pacific, drawing ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered catastrophic losses at battles like Midway and the Philippine Sea. But more devastating than the lost ships was the loss of experienced pilots. Japan's pilot training program couldn't replace skilled aviators at anything close to the rate they were being shot down. The success of American fighter direction, radar-controlled anti-aircraft guns, and especially the proximity fuse was making conventional bombing and torpedo attacks nearly suicidal. The numbers were stark. In the early war years, skilled Japanese pilots achieved hit rates of 10 to 15% on bombing runs. By 1944, those rates had plummeted to the single digits. Meanwhile, the Americans were putting up defensive fire so intense and accurate that Japanese aircraft were being destroyed before they could even reach their targets. Some reports from the era suggest that Japan's decision to adopt kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks where pilots deliberately crash explosive-laden aircraft into ships, was partially driven by the devastating effectiveness of American anti-aircraft defenses, including the proximity fuse. If conventional attacks couldn't get through, perhaps aircraft used as guided missiles could. The first organized kamikaze attacks began in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. American ships suddenly faced a new nightmare: pilots who didn't pull away, who pressed their attacks all the way to impact. Small-caliber anti-aircraft guns often couldn't generate enough firepower to destroy an incoming plane before it reached the ship, even when they scored multiple hits. This was where the proximity fuse revealed another crucial advantage. Because it didn't require direct hits, 5-inch guns firing proximity-fused shells could create a zone of lethal airbursts around a ship. A kamikaze aircraft flying through this zone would be shredded by shrapnel, often knocked off its trajectory or destroyed outright, even if the shell passed several yards away. The data from late 1944 showed the VT fuse's effectiveness against kamikazes. Approximately 500 rounds fired per aircraft destroyed, compared to 2,000 rounds for conventional ammunition. The simpler, more predictable trajectory of a kamikaze attack actually made proximity fuses even more lethal. By 1945, the proximity fuse had become the backbone of American naval air defense. Nearly 2/3 of all VT fuses expended during the entire war were fired in just the first 7.5 months of 1945, the period when kamikaze attacks reached their peak intensity. At Okinawa, the bloodiest naval battle in American history, proximity fuses proved their worth under the most extreme conditions. Wave after wave of kamikaze aircraft threw themselves at the American fleet. The Navy suffered grievous losses, 21 ships sunk, 66 damaged. But the carnage would have been far worse without the funny fuse, as sailors had begun calling it. Analysis of the battles off Okinawa revealed that proximity-fused shells were shooting down more than 200 Japanese aircraft. Vannevar Bush, head of the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development, later estimated that the VT fuse provided a 7-fold increase in the effectiveness of 5-inch anti-aircraft artillery. But there was an ironic detail in the data. Roughly 30% of proximity fuses were duds. They failed to detonate. And yet, even with this high failure rate, they were still dramatically more effective than conventional ammunition that worked 90 to 95% of the time. Think about that for a moment. A weapon that failed nearly 1/3 of the time was still several times more effective than its predecessor. That's how revolutionary the technology was. The fuse had also evolved beyond naval combat. After intense security concerns were finally overcome, proximity fuses were released for use over land in late 1944. During the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery equipped with VT fuses devastated German infantry formations. The shells would detonate a few meters above the ground, showering enemy troops with shrapnel. Traditional contact fuses would simply explode on impact with the ground, their effectiveness reduced by terrain and cover. General George Patton famously declared, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." But Patton was wrong about one thing. The war was nearly over, and new methods of warfare were already being tested in the deserts of New Mexico. While American ships in the Pacific were using proximity fuses to defend against kamikazes, another deadly threat was terrorizing Europe. Hitler's vengeance weapons, the V-1 flying bombs, were raining down on London and Antwerp. The V-1 was essentially an early cruise missile, a small, fast, unmanned aircraft packed with explosives. Traditional anti-aircraft guns struggled to hit them. The V-1s were small targets, flying at high speed and low altitude. Time-fused shells required perfect accuracy and timing to intercept them. But proximity fuses transformed the equation. British anti-aircraft batteries equipped with American VT-fused 90mm shells began shooting down V-1s with stunning efficiency. Historical records describe one British Home Guard unit watching in amazement as an American gun crew set up and destroyed 4 V-1s with just 8 shells. When the British gunners asked how they'd managed such accuracy, the American battery commander jokingly claimed his crew was made up of Tennessee sharpshooters. The truth remained classified. Winston Churchill later said, "These so-called proximity fuses made in the United States proved potent against the small unmanned aircraft with which we were assailed in 1944. On the last day V-1s were launched in large numbers against England, radar detected 104 approaching missiles. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells destroyed 68 of them. Only 4 reached London. When V-1 attacks shifted to the port of Antwerp in September 1944, the situation became critical. Antwerp was the Allies' main supply port for the push into Germany. If V-1s forced the port to close, the entire Allied offensive could stall. A desperate request went out for modified fuses compatible with British guns. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio, worked around the clock to produce them. Winston Churchill personally authorized a special flight of Lancaster bombers to transport the fuses across the Atlantic, an extraordinary measure that revealed how critical the technology had become. Once deployed, a single anti-aircraft unit in Antwerp destroyed 48 of the first 75 V-1s they encountered. The port remained open for the rest of the war. By war's end, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells had accounted for more than 2,000 V-1 kills. A weapon designed to defend ships in the Pacific had saved thousands of civilian lives in Europe. Throughout all of this success, one question haunted American and British military planners. What if the enemy captured an intact fuse? The Germans and Japanese were both technologically sophisticated. If they could reverse engineer the proximity fuse, they might be able to deploy it themselves, or worse, develop countermeasures. The Allies went to extraordinary lengths to prevent this. Initial deployment rules were strict. VT fuses could only be used over deep water where any duds would sink beyond recovery. This restriction prevented one of the fuse's most promising applications, anti-personnel artillery, from being used in Europe for years. But in December 1944, disaster nearly struck. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces overran an American ammunition dump. Inside were 20,000 proximity fuses for artillery shells. Panic gripped Allied intelligence. Had they just handed their greatest secret weapon to the enemy? A scientist named Winfield Salisbury had actually anticipated this scenario. He'd developed a radio jammer that could, in theory, prevent proximity fuses from functioning properly. Within days, 200 of these jammers were hastily constructed and installed in American bombers based in England, ready to be used if the Germans began deploying captured fuses. But the Germans never figured it out. German engineers had previously concluded that putting a functional radio inside an artillery shell was impossible. The acceleration forces during firing would destroy any vacuum tube-based electronics. When they examined the captured fuses, they apparently never recognized what they were looking at. The fuses remained in German storage, their revolutionary technology unappreciated, until Allied forces recaptured the area. The Japanese never captured an intact fuse either, though not for lack of trying. Every VT fuse contained a self-destruct mechanism designed to detonate the shell if it didn't find a target, ensuring the technology remained out of enemy hands. Recent research challenges the version that the Japanese had no idea what they were facing. Some sources indicate they attempted to develop their own proximity fuses late in the war, using photoelectric systems, but these experimental devices never saw widespread service. By the time Japan recognized the threat, the war was nearly over, and they lacked the industrial capacity to respond. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. World War II was over. In the aftermath, as historians began assessing the technologies that had shaped the war's outcome, the proximity fuse emerged as one of the most decisive innovations of the entire conflict. Vannevar Bush, who had overseen the entire American scientific war effort, credited the proximity fuse with 3 major strategic effects. First, it was crucial in defending the fleet against Japanese kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. Second, it played a key role in neutralizing German V-1 flying bombs attacking England. Third, it revolutionized land artillery tactics, particularly during the Battle of the Bulge. Historians have consistently ranked the VT fuse, alongside radar and the atomic bomb, as one of the 3 most important technological developments of World War II. Some experts argue that, in terms of overall impact on the war's conduct and duration, the proximity fuse may have been more significant than the atomic bomb, which was used only twice in combat. A post-war study analyzed 278 Japanese aircraft shot down by VT-fused projectiles between October 1944 and August 1945. Researchers estimated that only 46 of these aircraft would have been destroyed if conventional time-fused projectiles had been employed instead. That's a 6-to-1 advantage, and that's accounting for the fuse's roughly 30% failure rate. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal wrote, "Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater." But perhaps the most revealing assessment came from the Japanese themselves. After the war, when Japanese military officials learned about the proximity fuse and how it worked, their reaction was telling. They hadn't just been outfought, they'd been fighting against a weapon they never even knew existed. Reports from the era suggest they called it the weapon that made our aircraft defenseless. One burst, and it was over. The human cost of war is always measured in lives, and the proximity fuse's true impact becomes clear when we consider the lives it saved. If American ships had faced the full intensity of Japanese kamikaze attacks without proximity fuses, casualty estimates suggest thousands of additional sailors would have died. Ships that survived and continued fighting might have been sunk. The invasion of Okinawa, already the bloodiest naval battle in American history, could have been even more catastrophic. And what about the invasion of Japan itself, Operation Downfall, which was being planned before the atomic bombs ended the war? Military planners expected kamikaze attacks of unprecedented scale. Without effective anti-aircraft defenses, the invasion fleet would have been terribly vulnerable. Casualty estimates for Operation Downfall ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million Allied lives. The proximity fuse didn't prevent that invasion, the atomic bomb did. But if Operation Downfall had proceeded, the VT fuse would have been one of the few things standing between American sailors and waves of suicide aircraft. In Europe, the story was similar. The V-1 flying bombs killed over 6,000 British civilians before proximity fuses dramatically improved defense against them. Without VT fuses, that death toll could have been far higher. The port of Antwerp might have been forced to close, potentially stalling the Allied advance into Germany. There's another consideration, one that's harder to quantify. The proximity fuse's effectiveness against Japanese aircraft may have actually prolonged certain aspects of the war. Some sources indicate that when conventional bombing and torpedo attacks became nearly impossible due to American defenses, Japan turned to kamikaze tactics as a desperate alternative. The proximity fuse forced a shift to a more terrible form of warfare. Whether this assessment is entirely accurate remains debated among historians, but it raises an uncomfortable question. Did the VT fuse save lives, or did it simply change how those lives were lost? The answer is probably both. War creates these paradoxes. A weapon designed to defend ships from aerial attack became so effective that it forced the enemy to adopt suicide tactics, which that same weapon was then used to counter. In the calculus of total war, the proximity fuse was unquestionably a life-saving technology, at least for the side that possessed it. The proximity fuse's development represents one of the greatest collaborative scientific achievements in history. Over 100 American companies contributed to its production. Scores of scientists and engineers worked on different aspects of the problem. The total program employed thousands of workers who assembled and installed more than 22 million fuses by war's end. Companies as diverse as General Electric and Wurlitzer Organs contributed their specialized expertise. Crosley Corporation, better known for consumer radios, became one of the primary manufacturers. On January 5, 1943, when Lieutenant Cochrane aboard the Helena fired that first combat shot, the fuses in his shells had been manufactured by Crosley workers in Cincinnati, factory workers who never knew exactly what they were building or how it would be used. The miniaturized vacuum tubes that made the fuse possible were designed by James Van Allen, who would later become famous for discovering Earth's radiation belts. Lloyd Berkner's separated transmitter-receiver circuit was the breakthrough that made the Doppler effect detection system work. Dr. Merle Tuve coordinated the entire effort, earning the Presidential Medal for Merit from President Harry Truman. But the fuse's development also highlights an often overlooked aspect of World War II, the degree to which Allied victory depended on industrial capacity and scientific collaboration. The proximity fuse couldn't have been developed in isolation. It required contributions from multiple disciplines: physics, electrical engineering, chemistry, metallurgy, manufacturing. The Germans actually developed more than 30 different proximity fuse designs during the war, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound and radio fuses similar to the American design. But none ever saw service. Some sources indicate this was due to Hitler's directive that Germany should focus only on weapons that could be deployed within a year, a short-sighted policy that prevented development of potentially war-changing technologies. Japan attempted to develop photoelectric proximity fuses late in the war, but these experimental devices faced the same limitations that had caused the British to abandon similar designs. They only worked in daylight, and they could malfunction if they saw the sun directly. Japan lacked the time, resources, and industrial capacity to overcome these problems. The Allies didn't just outfight their enemies. In crucial ways, they outthought and outbuilt them. The end of World War II didn't mark the end of the proximity fuse's story. In fact, its influence had only begun. Post-war, the technology became standard in air defense systems worldwide. During the Cold War, both the United States and Soviet Union developed increasingly sophisticated proximity fuses for missiles, artillery, and anti-aircraft weapons. The basic principle, using radio waves or other sensors to detect proximity to a target and detonate automatically, became fundamental to modern warfare. The fuse's influence extended beyond weapons. The miniaturization techniques developed for the VT fuse contributed to the broader evolution of electronics. Creating vacuum tubes that could survive 20,000 G-forces required manufacturing precision that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the 1940s. These advances helped pave the way for the miniaturization of electronic components that would eventually lead to modern computers and smartphones. James Van Allen, the scientist who designed those revolutionary vacuum tubes, went on to use similar radiation-hardened electronics in the Explorer 1 satellite in 1958, which discovered the radiation belts that now bear his name. The space age had direct links to the proximity fuse program. The Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, created essentially to house Section T's proximity fuse research, grew into one of the world's premier research institutions. Today, it employs more than 8,800 people and conducts research for the Department of Defense, NASA, and various intelligence agencies. The laboratory that began with Dr. Tuve's impossible mission in 1940 is now the nation's largest university-affiliated research center. In military museums and collections, you can still see proximity fuses from World War II. They're small, unassuming devices, just a few inches tall, packed with miniaturized components that look primitive compared to modern electronics. But holding one, you're holding a piece of technology that historians rank alongside radar and the atomic bomb in importance. For the Japanese pilots who faced them, these small devices were the hidden enemy, the invisible force that made American anti-aircraft fire deadly accurate. They never captured one intact. They never fully understood what was destroying them. One burst, and it was over. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately a story about innovation under pressure. In August 1940, when Dr. Merle Tuve accepted the challenge of putting a radio inside an artillery shell, most experts believed it was impossible. The forces involved were too great, the space was too small, the complexity was too high. They were almost right. But the team at Section T didn't accept the word impossible. They broke the problem into smaller pieces. They recruited specialists from multiple disciplines. They tested, failed, and tested again. Within 2 years, they had created a weapon that would help win a war. Modern parallels are everywhere. Today's military technologies, from precision-guided munitions to autonomous drones, are descendants of the proximity fuse's revolutionary approach, letting the weapon itself make the decision to detonate rather than relying entirely on the operator's judgment. But the fuse also reminds us of war's paradoxes. It saved countless lives by taking countless lives. It defended ships by destroying aircraft. It may have prevented a catastrophic invasion of Japan, but it also contributed to the shift toward kamikaze tactics that made the Pacific War even more terrible. Lieutenant Red Cochran, standing at his gun station on the USS Helena on that January morning in 1943, couldn't have known any of this. He just knew that his shells had somehow destroyed an enemy aircraft that should have escaped. He didn't know he was witnessing the first combat use of a technology that would change warfare forever. The Japanese pilots diving on his ship certainly didn't know. They flew into a defensive envelope they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't evade. Some of them died never understanding what had killed them. War drives innovation like nothing else. The pressure to survive, to protect, to prevail, these forces unlock human ingenuity on scales that peacetime rarely matches. The proximity fuse stands as one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. One burst, and it was over. For thousands of Japanese pilots, that's exactly what happened, and they never knew why. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more untold stories of World War II's secret weapons.